Imagine a world standing on the edge of nuclear annihilation, where a single mistake could wipe out millions, and the fate of the entire planet rests in the hands of just a few leaders. Between 1960 and 1962, America faced a series of crises so intense, so dangerous, that they didn't just shape a presidency, they reshaped the entire nation. From failed invasions to walls dividing families, and missiles pointed straight at American cities, these were the moments that defined modern America. And today, we're diving deep into the drama, the tension, and the decisions that brought the world back from the brink. It all began with a new kind of leadership in the White House. John F. Kennedy, barely 43 years old, assumed the presidency in January 1961. He brought with him a sense of youthful energy and idealism that America had not seen in decades. But behind the charisma and the speeches filled with hope and promise, Kennedy inherited a world on edge. The Cold War was not just simmering, it was boiling. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, had expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, and the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large over global politics. Kennedy faced immediate tests that would define his presidency from the start. One of the earliest crises erupted not in Washington, but thousands of miles away in Cuba. Fidel Castro had overthrown Batista in 1959, and his revolution had unnerved the United States. By 1961, Castro's Cuba was closely allied with the Soviet Union, a mere 90 miles from the shores of Florida. To American eyes, it was a red flag in their own backyard, a beacon of communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. Kennedy, determined to act, greenlit a daring plan concocted during the Eisenhower administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The plan was audacious, almost cinematic in its scope. Around 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, would land on the southern coast of Cuba, spark an uprising, and overthrow Castro. It was supposed to be swift, clean, and decisive. In reality, it was a disaster. The invaders were met with overwhelming resistance, poorly coordinated, and ultimately crushed within 3 days. The failed invasion embarrassed the Kennedy administration, tarnished America's image worldwide, and most dangerously, pushed Cuba firmly into the Soviet orbit. It was a wake-up call for Kennedy. Diplomacy was not optional, and miscalculations could have global consequences. As if the Bay of Pigs humiliation wasn't enough, the crisis atmosphere only intensified over the next year. The Berlin Wall went up in August 1961, a concrete and barbed wire barrier slicing through the heart of Berlin. Families were divided, escape routes were severed, and the symbolism was unmistakable. The Cold War was no longer an abstract threat. It was real, visible, and terrifyingly close. Kennedy had to navigate these treacherous waters carefully. He delivered his famous speech in West Berlin, proclaiming, "Ich bin ein Berliner," a line that resonated not only with Germans, but with the world. It was a message of defiance against tyranny, a demonstration that America would stand firm in defense of freedom, even under the looming shadow of nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, the space race was heating up. Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space in April 1961, and the United States, behind in the cosmic race, was desperate to catch up. Kennedy made a bold promise that before the decade was out, America would put a man on the moon. While this might seem like a story about rockets and astronauts, it was deeply tied to the larger context of the Cold War. Technological superiority was equated with national security, with prestige, and with the ideological battle between capitalism and communism. Every achievement in space wasn't just scientific, it was political. But the true test of Kennedy's leadership came in October 1962, during what became the most dangerous confrontation of the 20th century, the Cuban Missile Crisis. American reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, capable of striking the entire eastern United States within minutes. The implications were staggering. For the first time, Americans realized that nuclear war could break out not as a distant possibility, but as an imminent reality. Kennedy and his advisors faced a dilemma: how to respond without triggering a full-scale nuclear war. Military action risked annihilation. Inaction risked allowing the Soviets to gain a strategic advantage. After intense deliberations, Kennedy chose a middle path: a naval blockade, or, as he called it, a quarantine of Cuba. This was a high-stakes gamble. Khrushchev's missiles were already operational, and the world watched as two superpowers engaged in a deadly game of brinkmanship. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath. Diplomats exchanged letters, generals prepared for war, and ordinary citizens went about their lives under the shadow of a potential apocalypse. The negotiation was as psychological as it was political. Kennedy insisted on the removal of missiles from Cuba, while secretly agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey at a later date. After agonizing days, Khrushchev agreed. The missiles were dismantled, the crisis ended, and the world exhaled. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought humanity closer to nuclear destruction than ever before, but it also demonstrated the power of careful, strategic diplomacy. These years, from 1960 to 1962, were more than a series of crises. They were transformative. They shaped American foreign policy, proving that the United States needed both strength and restraint in the nuclear age. They shaped American politics, showing that leadership demanded not just vision, but decisiveness under pressure. And they shaped American culture, embedding a sense of vulnerability, urgency, and global awareness that would influence generations. The crises also revealed something profound about the American psyche. The Cold War was no longer just a geopolitical struggle, it was an existential one. Schools began teaching duck and cover drills, families built bomb shelters in backyards. And every decision in Washington was weighed against the unthinkable possibility of annihilation. Yet, amid fear, there was innovation, ambition, and a sense of possibility. Kennedy's vision for space exploration, for example, was born from the same pressures and anxieties that fueled the missile crisis. The tension between fear and aspiration defined the era. One could argue that the events of these 3 years also reshaped the presidency itself. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis established a model for crisis management that emphasized careful consultation, clear communication, and moral courage. He avoided rash military action, chose negotiation over confrontation, and maintained an unwavering commitment to avoiding nuclear war. In doing so, he redefined what it meant to lead in a modern, interconnected, and dangerously armed world. And yet, the story of 1960 to 1962 is not only about politics, diplomacy, or war. It's about the people who lived through it, the ordinary Americans who experienced these tensions in their daily lives. It's about children practicing air raid drills, journalists covering the crisis with urgency and fear, and communities grappling with the looming shadow of a possible nuclear strike. It's about how a nation internalized the notion that global events, even in distant lands, could have immediate, tangible consequences on their homes, their futures, and their children's futures. By the end of 1962, America had emerged shaken but profoundly changed. The Bay of Pigs taught humility, the Berlin Wall underscored the stakes of ideological conflict, and the Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the delicate balance between power and diplomacy. These events collectively shaped modern American foreign policy, strengthened the executive branch in times of international crisis, and deepened the national understanding that in an era of nuclear weapons, survival depended not just on might, but on wisdom, courage, and careful strategy. In hindsight, the period from 1960 to 1962 feels almost cinematic, a mix of tragedy, tension, and triumph. It's a story of young leadership tested by global challenges, of ideological conflict made real in neighborhoods and streets, and of humanity teetering on the edge, only to step back from the brink. These years remind us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a living, breathing drama, shaped by choices, chance, and character. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. The crises of 1960 to 1962 were not isolated incidents. They were moments when the fate of nations, and indeed the fate of the world, was in the hands of a few individuals, navigating a landscape fraught with peril. They remind us that courage, intelligence, and careful deliberation matter. They remind us that history is not inevitable. It is shaped by decisions, negotiations, and the will to confront danger without succumbing to panic. As we look back over these transformative years, it becomes clear that 1960 to 1962 did more than challenge America. They helped define it. They forged a modern consciousness, a new understanding of the global stakes, and a political and cultural resilience that continues to influence the nation today. And in the end, they remind us that even in the darkest moments, careful leadership, moral clarity, and the courage to choose diplomacy over destruction can steer humanity away from catastrophe. So, when we think about these years, the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are not just remembering history. We are seeing a mirror of human courage and folly, of ambition and fear, of the choices that define not only nations, but the very course of civilization. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, studied, and shared, because the lessons of 1960 to 1962 are not just for the past. They are for every moment when the world feels as if it is standing at the edge of the unknown.